Most people don't realize this, but the reason your life feels familiar is because it is. Not similar, not kind of the same. The same patterns, the same frustrations, the same emotional loops, different faces, different jobs, different years, but the same story. And the most disturbing part is this. You're not repeating your life because you're failing. You're repeating it because something inside you hasn't changed. And no amount of effort can fix what effort itself is reinforcing. You try to move forward. You change habits. You change environments. Sometimes you even change yourself. And for a moment, it feels like progress. But then, quietly, without warning, you find yourself back in the same place. Same emotional weight, same dissatisfaction, same sense that something is missing. You ask yourself, why does this keep happening to me? And most answers you're given are shallow. You didn't try hard enough. You weren't disciplined enough. You weren't positive enough. But deep down, you know that's not true, because you are trying, and the repetition continues anyway. Here's what no one tells you. Repetition is not a mistake. It's a structure. Life doesn't repeat itself randomly. It repeats according to identity. As long as the inner structure remains the same, the outer world has no choice but to reorganize itself into familiar patterns. Change the scenery, and the structure rebuilds the same room. Change the people, and the same dynamics reappear. This isn't bad luck. It's design. Ancient Gnostic teaching spoke of this long before psychology existed. They didn't describe life as a straight line forward. They described it as a wheel, a cycle powered not by fate, but by unconscious identification. They believed most people live inside a constructed reality, not because they are controlled by force, but because they keep feeding the same inner pattern. The wheel doesn't turn because someone pushes it. It turns because something inside you keeps pulling it back. Modern spirituality tells you to manifest a new life. But manifestation doesn't break cycles. It decorates them. You can manifest money and repeat emotional emptiness. You can manifest relationships and repeat abandonment. You can manifest success and repeat inner exhaustion. Why? Because manifestation operates on the surface. Repetition is rooted deeper. Here's the uncomfortable truth. If your life keeps repeating, it's because some part of you needs it to. Not consciously, not morally, but structurally. There is a version of you that knows how to survive this life, and survival prefers familiarity over freedom, even when familiarity hurts. So the real question is not, how do I create a different life? The real question is, what inside me refuses to let this one end? Until that is seen clearly, every attempt at change becomes another turn of the same wheel. And most people never realize they are not moving forward. They are circling. There is a reason repetition feels stronger than change. And it's not because you lack willpower. It's because repetition is protected, not by the world, but by the part of you that learned how to survive inside it. According to Gnostic thought, most people do not live from their true self. They live from a constructed identity, a self built from memory, adaptation, fear, and defense. This false self forms early. It learns how to be accepted, how to avoid pain, how to remain functional. And once it works, it refuses to disappear, because its entire purpose is continuity, not truth, not freedom. Continuity. Here is something crucial to understand. Change threatens the false self even when change is good, because the false self does not measure life by fulfillment. It measures life by familiarity. Anything unfamiliar feels unsafe, even peace, even expansion, even freedom. So when real change begins approaching, the system reacts, not with resistance you can see, but with subtle redirection. This is how the repetition operates. You feel dissatisfaction. You seek improvement. You make effort. The false self allows this, as long as improvement does not threaten its core identity. You can change circumstances. You can change roles. You can change external behaviors. But the lens remains the same, and the lens determines the world you see. So life rearranges itself to match the same inner viewpoint. New setting, same story. The mind reinforces repetition by explaining it. It creates narratives. This time is different. This will finally work. I've learned from the past. But explanation is not transformation. Understanding the pattern does not dissolve the pattern. The Gnostics warned of this. They said the greatest prison is the one you can explain, because explanation gives the illusion of progress while leaving structure untouched. In Gnostic language, this structure was symbolized by the archons, not as beings with wings or claws, but as forces of fixation, patterns of thought, emotional gravity, identity loops. They rule not by force, but by repetition. As long as you keep returning to the same inner posture, the same life will keep returning to you. Here is the moment most people never reach, the realization that effort alone belongs to the same system that keeps you trapped. Trying harder does not break the wheel. Trying harder feeds it, because effort comes from the false self attempting to improve its own condition, and the false self can never transcend itself. This is why people say, "I've done everything," but what they really mean is, "I've done everything from the same place, same identity, same emotional center, same perception of self, different strategies, same observer." So life repeats. Here is a truth that feels almost offensive. If your life keeps repeating, it's because the current version of you still serves a purpose. It protects something, it avoids something, it preserves something. And until that function is seen, the repetition remains necessary. The cycle doesn't break when you fight it. It weakens when you recognize who is keeping it alive. Not the world, not fate, not other people, but the identity that cannot survive without the familiar. And that recognition changes everything, not because it fixes the problem, but because it exposes the structure behind it. There is a reason repetition doesn't just feel frustrating, it feels inevitable, as if no matter what you do, you end up back in the same place. This is why many people quietly conclude, "This is just my life. This is who I am. This is my fate." But repetition is not fate. It only feels like fate when its mechanism remains invisible. The human mind is wired to look for causes. When the same patterns repeat long enough, the mind stops questioning them. It begins to normalize them. What repeats becomes reality. What persists becomes truth. What doesn't change becomes identity. And once repetition fuses with identity, it stops being questioned. That is the moment the cycle becomes invisible, not because it disappeared, but because it became familiar. The Gnostics spoke about time in a way most people misunderstand. They did not see time only as clocks and calendars. They spoke of psychological time, inner time, a loop made of memory and expectation. Memory pulls you backward, expectation pulls you forward, and you live suspended between the two. But here's the crucial part. Both memory and expectation belong to the same identity. So even when you imagine a different future, you imagine it from the same inner structure. That's why the future keeps recreating the past. Modern culture says, leave the past behind. Visualize a better future. Reinvent yourself. But reinvention still uses the same core observer. You don't escape a loop by rearranging its content. You escape it by seeing who is looping. Without that, the mind simply changes costumes. Same actor, same stage, different scene. This is where the teaching becomes uncomfortable. Repetition survives because it is tolerable. Not pleasant, not fulfilling, but tolerable. It hurts. But it hurts in a familiar way, and the mind prefers familiar pain over unfamiliar uncertainty. That's why many people subconsciously sabotage real change. Because real change doesn't just threaten comfort, it threatens identity. In Gnostic symbolism, this repetition was described as a wheel, not a punishment, a mechanism. Each rotation reinforces the sense of me. Each repetition strengthens the story. This is who I am. And the longer the wheel turns, the more real the story feels. Until questioning it feels absurd, even dangerous. Here is the fear beneath repetition. If this pattern ends, who am I without it? Most people don't cling to suffering itself. They cling to the known self inside suffering. Because even a painful identity feels safer than no identity at all. So the wheel turns. Again, this is critical. The cycle does not loosen when you understand it intellectually. It loosens when you notice your emotional attachment to it. The moment you see, I am invested in this repetition, not because you like it, but because it defines you. That recognition creates a crack, a small one at first, but real. The Gnostics called this moment Gnosis, not knowledge, not belief, but direct seeing. Seeing the pattern without immediately trying to fix it. Seeing the self without defending it. This is where time begins to collapse, because the observer is no longer fused with the loop. The wheel still turns, but something has stepped out of it. When the cycle loosens, people often feel lost, confused, empty, not because something went wrong, but because the identity that organized their life is no longer in control. This is why many retreat back into repetition, not because they failed, but because freedom feels like disintegration at first. Repetition is not your enemy. It is your teacher. It shows you exactly where identity is still clinging, where fear still governs, where familiarity still feels safer than truth. And once you see that clearly, the wheel begins to lose momentum. Not through effort, through awareness. Most people never reach this stage. They remain trapped in time, mistaking repetition for destiny. But the moment you see that time itself is part of the loop, something shifts. And when time loosens its grip, the cycle no longer owns you. There is a moment most people are never warned about. A moment that comes after insight, after awareness, after the wheel begins to loosen. And it feels nothing like freedom. It feels like loss. When repetition weakens, life does not immediately improve. There is no sudden clarity, no instant relief, no sense of, finally, I'm free. Instead, something far more unsettling appears. Silence. Not peaceful silence, but empty silence, the kind that makes you restless. This is the part no one talks about. When the false self loses control, it doesn't disappear quietly. It dissolves into uncertainty. The habits that once defined you feel distant. The emotional reactions that once felt automatic lose force. The old motivations stop working, and in their place, nothing. This emptiness is not a problem, but it feels like one. because the mind has been trained to fill space. At this stage, most people panic. They say things like, "I feel lost. I don't know who I am anymore. I think something is wrong." And instead of staying with the emptiness, they run back to familiarity. They revive old goals, old identities, old dramas, not because those were good, but because they were known. Repetition offers structure, even if it hurts. Here's something crucial. Identity does not exist to make you happy. It exists to make you coherent. It organizes reality. It gives you a sense of continuity. So when identity dissolves, the world feels unorganized, unstable. This instability is not danger, but the nervous system interprets it as such. That's why breaking cycles feels threatening. Most people believe that awakening should feel empowering, but in its early stages, awakening feels disempowering because the sense of "I know who I am" collapses, and without that reference point, the mind scrambles. This is why many people prefer a painful life they understand over an open life they don't. At this point, a new trap appears, the urge to rebuild identity, to say, "Okay, now I'll build a better version of myself, a more spiritual self, a more aware self." But this is just repetition in disguise, a new mask, a refined loop. The Gnostics warned about this specifically. They called it the counterfeit self, an identity built from insight rather than ignorance. More subtle, more convincing, but still a structure. Breaking repetition does not require replacement. It requires non-interference. The willingness to not immediately define yourself again, to remain present in uncertainty without rushing to fill it. This is extraordinarily difficult because the mind equates emptiness with failure. But emptiness is not absence. It is unoccupied awareness. Here is a paradox most never understand. Real change does not feel like progress. It feels like less effort, less narrative, less urgency, less self-concern. The compulsion to fix life weakens, not because life is perfect, but because the one who needed fixing is no longer in charge. When this shift happens, the external world often reacts. People may say, "You've changed. You're different. You're distant." Not because you became cold, but because you are no longer predictable. And unpredictability unsettles systems that rely on repetition. This is the moment of choice. Most people don't see it as a choice, but it is. You can return to the known loop, or you can remain present in the unknown. One offers comfort, the other offers truth. And the cost of truth is the death of who you thought you were. Breaking the cycle is not about becoming someone new. It's about allowing someone false to fall away. And that falling away feels like loss only because it was never questioned before. But once the false structure weakens enough, the repetition no longer has anything to orbit around. There is a stage that comes after the emptiness. Most people never stay long enough to reach it because the emptiness feels like failure, like stagnation, like being lost. But if you don't run from it, something subtle begins to happen, not dramatically, not all at once, quietly. At first, nothing seems to improve. Your life doesn't suddenly transform. Your problems don't magically disappear. But one thing changes. The pressure to fix everything begins to weaken. You notice that the constant internal urgency, the need to optimize, correct, improve, escape, starts to dissolve. Not because you gave up, but because something deeper stopped pushing. Most people mistake control for direction. They believe that without effort, life will collapse. But what actually collapses is only the false sense of control. What remains is clarity. And clarity does not need force. It doesn't demand. It doesn't rush. It observes. This is where repetition truly weakens. Not because you fought it, but because the center that sustained it is gone. Life begins to respond differently when there is no longer a rigid identity demanding outcomes. Opportunities appear not because you manifested them, but because you stopped blocking them. Decisions feel simpler, not because they're easier, but because they're no longer filtered through fear. Here's something few people notice. The first thing that changes is not your circumstances, it's your relationship to them. The same situation arises, but it no longer hooks you the same way. The same challenge appears, but it doesn't define you. This is not detachment, it's non-identification. And non-identification is freedom in its earliest form. This stage cannot be imitated. Anyone trying to act awakened here immediately rebuilds the false self. That's why the Gnostics emphasized seeing, not doing. Because doing always comes from identity. Seeing dissolves identity. And without identity, repetition has nothing to anchor to. Many people expect awakening to feel euphoric, but what often appears instead is calm, not excitement, not bliss, a quiet steadiness. At first, this can feel underwhelming because the nervous system is used to intensity, drama, urgency, struggle. Calm feels unfamiliar, almost boring, but calm is not emptiness, it's unfragmented awareness. As this settles, something else fades, the constant internal narration, the voice that interprets everything as success or failure. Without that narration, life feels more direct, less symbolic, less personal. And that's when repetition truly begins to break, because repetition depends on storytelling. It needs a me moving through time. Without that, cycles lose continuity. Even now, another subtle trap can appear, the desire to stay in this state, to protect it, to define it. But the moment you try to preserve clarity, it becomes identity again. True freedom is not a state, it's the absence of fixation. So even this calm must be allowed to come and go. Eventually, action returns, but it's different. Action without compulsion. Movement without desperation. You do things, but they don't define you. You choose, but the choice doesn't carry your entire identity. This is not indifference. It's alignment without obsession. Here is a sign that repetition is truly ending. You stop asking, when will my life change? Because you're no longer waiting for a future version of yourself. You're no longer negotiating with time. You're here. And here does not repeat. Breaking the cycle does not mean life becomes perfect. It means life becomes honest. And honesty does not need repetition to feel real. The wheel slows. Not because you pushed against it, but because there is no longer anything feeding its motion. There is something most teachings avoid saying clearly. Even after the cycle weakens, even after awareness deepens, the repetition can try to return. And when it does, many people believe they've failed. They think, I lost it. I went backwards. I did something wrong. But that belief itself is part of the old structure. Repetition does not end abruptly. It fades, and fading structures often attempt one final consolidation. The false self senses loss of control and tries to reassert relevance, not dramatically, subtly, through familiar thoughts, through old emotional hooks, through situations that once defined you. This is not regression, it is residue. Here's a distinction most people miss. A recurrence of patterns is not the same as identification with them. You may feel old emotions arise, old habits reappear, old thoughts resurface. But the crucial difference is this: do they define you, or are they observed? Repetition survives only through identification. Without it, it has no gravity. At this stage, many people fall into a new trap: constant self-monitoring. They watch every thought, every feeling, every reaction, trying to prevent the cycle from returning. But vigilance is still control, and control belongs to the old system. Awareness is not surveillance. Awareness is openness. Earlier, fear came from pain. Now fear comes from loss of clarity. People begin to think, what if I lose this awareness? What if I fall back completely? This fear can recreate tension, and tension can invite identity to return. So the cycle tries again, not because it is powerful, but because fear feeds it. The Gnostics emphasized something very precise. Liberation is maintained not through effort, but through non-attachment. Not attachment to suffering, not attachment to clarity. Attachment itself is the mechanism. So even awareness must remain unattached. Here is something rarely discussed in Gnosis: compassion for your former self. The part of you that lived in repetition was not evil. It was protective. It learned how to survive. So when it resurfaces, meeting it with rejection only strengthens it. Meeting it with recognition dissolves it. The moment a pattern returns, most people react. They judge it, they analyze it, they try to remove it. But reaction fuels continuity. Instead, something simpler is required: recognition without resistance, seeing the pattern without trying to correct it. This is where repetition truly loses power. The wheel does not stop because it is destroyed. It stops because nothing pushes it. Fear pushes it, hope pushes it, identity pushes it. When none of these engage, the wheel slows naturally. Here is a sign that awareness has stabilized. You stop worrying about whether the cycle will return, not because you are confident, but because you are no longer invested. Life may move, patterns may arise, but they no longer define you. As vigilance fades, silence deepens, not the silence of effort, but the silence of presence. In this silence, repetition cannot survive, because repetition requires narrative, and silence has none. This stage often feels subtle, too subtle for language, which is why many people try to dramatize it. But dramatization recreates identity. True transformation here feels almost ordinary, and that ordinariness is what makes it real. Breaking repetition is not a victory. It is not an achievement. It is the quiet ending of a story that no longer needs to be told. And when stories end, life does not collapse. It opens. At some point, a quiet realization begins to form, not as a thought, not as a conclusion, but as a shift in how life is experienced. You stop asking why the cycle existed and begin to see what it was pointing toward. The need to understand everything fades, not because answers were found, but because the one who needed answers is no longer in control. This is difficult to explain, because we are used to transformation feeling like accumulation. More knowledge, more insight, more identity. But real change moves in the opposite direction. It subtracts. When repetition ends, what disappears is not your life. It's the internal compulsion to repeat it, the pressure to become someone, the urgency to arrive somewhere, the belief that fulfillment is ahead. Without that pressure, life becomes immediate, not perfect, immediate. Many people believe awakening should solve their problems. But awakening doesn't solve problems. It reveals which ones were never real to begin with. The problems tied to identity, to comparison, to imagined futures. They dissolve when identity dissolves. What remains are simple challenges, practical ones, human ones, and those can be met directly, without narrative. When repetition ends, life no longer moves in circles. It moves in responses. You respond to what is here, not to what you fear might happen. You act, not to escape the present, but because action is appropriate. There is no path anymore, only presence. From the outside, your life may look ordinary. You may still work, still relate, still live in the world. But internally, something fundamental has shifted. Life is no longer something you are trying to get through. It is something you are inside of, fully. At this stage, some people try to turn this into a philosophy. They explain it, teach it, defend it. But explanation recreates distance. Truth here is lived, not held. This is why the Gnostics emphasized remembrance, not doctrine, because remembrance is immediate. Doctrine is repetition. The end of repetition is surprisingly simple. There is no ceremony, no announcement, just a gradual noticing that you are no longer waiting, not waiting for yourself to change, not waiting for life to begin, not waiting for the next version of you. Waiting was the loop. Presence is the exit. In this silence, nothing is demanded of you. You don't need to be better. You don't need to be awakened. You don't need to escape. The effort ends. And when effort ends, life stops resisting itself. What remains is not enlightenment. It's clarity without struggle, awareness without urgency, a life that unfolds without needing to justify itself. And that is why repetition can never return here, because there is no longer a self that needs it. You were never repeating your life because you were broken. You were repeating it because you were identified, and identification ends not through force, but through seeing. Once that seeing stabilizes, the wheel has nothing to turn around. If this reflection resonated, it's not because it taught you something new, it's because it reminded you of something you already sensed, that the repetition wasn't your prison. It was your signal. And now that the signal has been seen, it no longer needs to repeat. This is the Inner Gnosis Archive.